Allan Lichtman returns to the show. He is a distinguished professor of history at the American University. He's well known for having called every single presidential election in the last 40 years. He was on the show back in July, and we had talked about his 13 keys to the White House. And back then, it was right before the Democratic National Convention. Professor Lichtman has told us that after the convention, he would give us his final prediction. And now he does have a final prediction for who he believes would win the White House. Welcome back to the show, Professor Lichtman.
Thank you.
We're gonna get your forecast. Let's go over the keys, and I like to start by talking about some of the major events, political events and economic events that have happened since the middle of July, since we last spoke, and how they may or may not have impacted your keys. Let's start with immediately after we spoke on the 10th of July, I believe. There was an assassination attempt on Trump, the first of two reported assassination attempts this year. His popularity in the polls immediately shot up temporarily. Did that event affect any of the keys at all, in particular the charisma key?
It did not. To turn the charisma key, you can't just have a sympathy. You have to be one of those once in a generation, truly inspirational across the board, cross partisanship, transformational candidates. Trump is a great showman. He has a strong following, but he doesn't fit the criteria of the key because he only appeals to a narrow base. That's not how the key works. In 4 years as president, his approval rating on average was 41%, right at the bottom of presidents, his base. In 2 elections, he lost the vote of the people by a combined 10 million votes. The two iconic candidates who fit this key are Franklin Roosevelt on the Democratic side, Ronald Reagan on the Republican side, and they won 6 elections by landslides. So whatever you may think of Trump, whatever sympathy you may have for him, it has no impact on the key.
It wouldn't impact even the swing voters' perception of him as having survived a harrowing event.
You know, people always tell me,
Yeah.
I have a better way of interpreting your keys. I'll look at the swing voters. I'll
Sure.
look at public polls about the economy. And my answer is, if you want to develop your own system, go right ahead and do it. Of course, they never do. But if you're going to use my system, you've got to stick with how I define the keys and how I've answered the keys for 160 years, from the election of 1860 and the horse and buggy days of politics to the election of Biden in 2020.
All right. I'll leave your keys up. By the way, you should visit, if you're watching this now, you should visit Professor Lichtman's interview with me in July, where we went over the keys in detail. We're just going to revisit some of them today. I like to move on to number 3, incumbency. The incumbent party candidate is a sitting president. Does this still apply, Professor Lichtman, if Kamala Harris joined the race after Joe Biden, who was the incumbent president? He dropped out?
No, it does not. It's a very binary specific key. Only that key favors the incumbent if the party candidate is the sitting president, as it plainly says. So the keys fully take into account Biden pulling out. They lost that key. I was very critical, as you know, of the Democrats because I thought that they were, well, obviously they were publicly trashing in vicious ways their sitting president. I've never seen that, and I've studied politics since the founding. And I thought they were heading for a disaster, that they'd not only lose that one key, but they're also going to have a big party brawl and lose that other key right there, the contest key. No incumbent party has ever been reelected when they lost both those keys, but somehow, maybe they listened to me, I doubt it, they grew a spine and a brain, united behind Harris. So the dropout of Biden only cost them the incumbency key, not the contest key.
Did it surprise you at all that the Republicans did not gain more favor following the dropout of Joe Biden? Presumably, the people who supported the Democratic Party supported Biden and not Harris, but things didn't work out that way. Were you surprised at the way things developed?
I don't follow the polls. They're snapshots. They're not predictors. They're abused as predictors by clerks like Nate Silver, who told us, oh, Hillary Clinton has a 70 to 80% chance of winning. Then she loses. And he says, see, I told you she had a 20% plus chance of losing. Meaningless stuff. The keys fully take into account the transformation in the Democratic Party, as I said, costing them one key, but not the contest key. And the Harris candidacy, I think, helped them with two other keys. Voters no longer had to choose between two old white guys. Hate saying that, being an old white guy myself, but I think that contributed to the fizzling of RFK Jr. and the salvaging of the third party key. Also, the social unrest key. The protests were directed against Biden. He's now in the background. And I think that contributed to the decline of the protests and the salvaging of the social unrest key. So the keys fully take into account the transformation in our politics over the last few months without fixating on polls. You know, during Kennedy and Nixon in 1960, which I'm old enough to remember, there was a poll once every couple of weeks, and no one wasn't happy with that. Now there's a poll every couple of hours, and the media fixates on these constantly fluctuating polls, which are almost entirely noise anyway, because the error margin is far greater than the so-called plus and minus 3% that they tell you. That's pure statistical error. Add on to that the fact that people don't respond to pollsters. They may lie. They may not have focused on the election. The election is not being held today and may change their minds. And the pollsters have no idea who's actually going to vote. So they have to guess at the likely voters, and that at least doubles, if not more, the error margins, making these polls essentially noise.
I know we're jumping around for a bit. We talked about 13 challenger charisma. What about incumbent charisma? Do you think we have a point in favor of Kamala for number 12, incumbent charisma? The incumbent party candidate is charismatic or a national hero?
Look, whatever you may think of Harris, and her approval ratings have gone up a lot, but they're still about 50-50. She is not yet, she's only been a candidate for a couple of months, established herself as a Franklin Roosevelt. So I count that key against the White House party.
Okay. So if it's against the Democrats for 12 and against the Republicans for
Whoa,
13, do they
Let me
cancel
correct
out?
you. Let me
Yeah.
correct you. It's not
Okay.
against the Republicans. It means that key 13 doesn't count
Ah,
against the incumbent party. They're always measured against the incumbent party, with the decision rule being if fewer than six go against the incumbent party, they're predicted losers. Five or predicted winners. Five or fewer, incumbent party is a predicted winner.
I see. So just to understand how the score is calculated, you don't assign like a -1 if it doesn't fit.
No,
You
no,
just leave it
no.
like, okay.
I
Got
assign
it.
only minuses against the White House party. With the decision rule, they can lose up to five and still be predicted winners.
Number 8, there is no sustained social unrest during the term, discounting the assassination attempt on Trump. That I think that still is the case. How would you assign a score if that doesn't apply?
That counts. And again, the way these are, that
Yeah.
doesn't count against the Democrats,
Okay.
because to sustain that key, there has to be massive, sustained social unrest sufficient to call into question the stability of the society, like we saw in the 1960s. And as I said, these protests have not come close.
Does it? Okay, number 9, scandal against the president were the incumbent. Now, the sitting president at the time, Joe Biden, does it count as a scandal against him and ultimately the Democrats if he drops out, some say even due to pressure from his own party?
Absolutely not. The way the key is defined, it has to be corruption directly implicating the president with at least some bipartisan recognition of scandal. And it can't be the president's brother, the president's son. It can't be Hunter Biden, just as it wasn't Billy Carter, Jimmy Carter's reprobate brother. And there's no scandal on Biden. Republicans have been trying for 4 years to pin a scandal on him and have come up empty. Even their so-called smoking gun witness, Mr. Smirnov, was arrested by the FBI for lying about Biden and spreading Russian propaganda.
Okay, that aside, number 7, policy change. The incumbent administration affects major changes in national policy. Is that currently a point in the Democrats' favor, Professor?
Absolutely. That's really very easy. The differences in policy. between Trump and Biden are massive. Biden overturning Trump's executive orders on the environment and immigration, rejoining the Paris Accords on climate, the inflation and climate change bill, the infrastructure bill, the stimulus bill. The policy contrast couldn't be greater.
Do you take into account what some pundits and economists may speculate what would happen, what may happen to the economy if, let's say, we have a Democrat or Republican win? For example, it has been speculated, and this is not my personal opinion, but it was speculated that Harris's tax policies could not only crash the stock markets, but also help destroy some jobs. This is a criticism against Harris. Do you take such criticism into account and project into the future what may be adverse for the economy?
These are the talking points you hear in every election on both sides. And what I do with them is what the great philosopher David Hume said you should do to works of superstition, consign them to the flames. Partisan talking points have zero predictive value for the outcomes of presidential elections.
What if, let's say, we talk about going back to Trump, for example? He was the president once. We know what his policies are in regards to tariffs. Economists have speculated that if he were to reintroduce tariffs or heighten them, like he suggested, he said that he wants to implement a 100% tariff on any country that wants to de-dollarize or dump the dollar. That could be bad for imports. That could be bad for the economy. How does that
Same
particular
answer I
policy?
gave to the criticisms of Harris. These are talking points. You hear them in every election on
Okay.
both sides, criticizing each other's policies. Zero predictive value. And nothing has a predictive value, let me tell you, unless it
Mhm.
implicates a key. That's the beauty of the system. It's purely self-contained. It's the northern star of prediction. Hasn't changed since I developed it going back to 1860.
Can we talk about the economy, both short term and long term? First of all, has the Federal Reserve's decision to cut rates by 50 basis points, has that changed your outlook for the economy or the positioning or the situation for economic growth at all?
I don't base my predictions on outlook for the economy. Again, if you want to develop your own system, go right ahead. My two economic keys are cut and dry. Key number 5, short term, there is no recession in the election year. Key number 6, long term, real per capita growth during the term at least equals real per capita growth over the previous two terms, and both of these keys are clearly true.
I'm going to show you just one chart here. This may or may not be useful in factoring in, but federal spending on food stamps has grown in recent years. You're looking at unemployment rate rising. Would you factor this into account and say, well, maybe the economy is deteriorating for some, perhaps people are more disgruntled? Has that been considered, Professor?
I told you what my keys are. They're quantitative, they're very
Yeah,
specific. If you want to develop a system based on something else, go right ahead. Again, there are talking points on both sides. The Biden folks say we brought inflation down from 9% to 2.5%. We have record stock market. We have record employment. The other side says, we have too much spending, too much inflation, whatever. Irrelevant to the keys.
what is your assessment on the current economic condition? Is the economy still growing to the extent that it would benefit the incumbent, or are we in a recession, do you think?
We are clearly not in a recession. Recession is not going to take hold in 50 days. That's impossible. And as I said, real per capita growth during the term is actually double the average of the previous two terms. So again, in the context of my system, both those keys are true. All this other stuff is irrelevant.
I'm just curious, hypothetically, what would make you think we're in a recession? In other words, what indicators would you have to see to say conclusively, yes, the economy has contracted or is contracting, and that's a point against whatever incumbent party it happens to be?
Well, there are two ways of assessing recessions, both of
Yes,
which are not going to happen in 50 days. One is two consecutive negative quarters. Not going to happen. I'm going to get one negative quarter. And
sure.
two is the National Bureau of Economic Research, uh, who looks at a range of indicators, declares a recession. I don't declare recessions.
Okay, so you're looking at data that the NBER puts out. All right. We've gone over most of the keys. You specified to me in July that you were waiting for the Democratic National Convention before making your final prediction. Any developments from that event that have changed or consolidated your viewpoints?
What was so important, as I already explained, for consolidating my viewpoint was the Democrats uniting behind Harris and salvaging the contest key.
Mhm. Why is it that the debate performances, like you told me last time, weren't very consistent in predicting the outcome of the election? So, generally speaking, how do debates impact the outcome?
Not at all. They're not predictive and they don't affect the key. Hillary Clinton won all the debates and still lost.
Right.
John Kerry won the debates against that very bad debate at George W. Bush and still lost. Barack Obama was trounced, the worst trouncing, even worse than Biden in his first debate with Romney, and still won. So you can't conclude anything about final outcomes from debates. Again, I can't stress this too much. The keys gauge the big picture of how American presidential elections really work. And all of these ephemeral events don't affect the prediction unless they impact a key.
What about the Biden versus Trump debate? I mean, arguably Biden lost and he had to step down. Was that an exception, Professor?
It was fully taken into account by the keys. Didn't predict the outcome of the election, but the keys, as I already explained to you, fully incorporated that change.
Finally, the last two keys, 10 and 11, foreign military failure and foreign military success. How is that measured? Do you look at active wars that the U.S. is currently engaged in or its allies as well?
Well, anything that implicates American national security. Those are the two hardest, the only two keys that I think are at all hard to call. And it doesn't matter how you call them, even if they both flipped against the incumbents, that would still only be five keys and a predicted win for Harris. And I split them. I gave the administration a failure. I counted the failure key against them because of what's going on in Gaza, a humanitarian disaster with no end in sight. I know we don't have boots on the ground there, but we're deeply implicated in those events. I split the keys. I gave the administration a success in Ukraine because it was Biden and Biden alone who put together the coalition of the West that kept Putin from conquering Ukraine and then threatening America's national security deeply by going after our NATO allies, and continued Biden support in the face of reluctant Republicans have kept Ukraine alive for over 2.5 years and even enabled them to make an incursion into Russia. I think this will go down in history as a major presidential accomplishment.
To sum up, which keys, and most of them are for the Democrats, but which keys would you assign not to the Democrats?
Yes. The mandate key based on Democratic losses in the midterm elections,
Mm-hmm.
the U.S. House, incumbency key, which we talked about, incumbent charisma, which we talked about, foreign/military failure. That's four, two keys short of what we needed to predict their defeat. That's why I'm saying, wars are fluid. The things can change in wars, but even if the success key flipped against them, something went horribly wrong in Ukraine, I don't think it's going to happen, but just hypothetically, the prediction for a Harris win, the prediction that we were going to have a new unprecedented president wouldn't change. I'm predicting the first woman president, cracking, if not shattering, the glass ceiling, and the first president of mixed African and East Asian descent, kind of foreshadowing where America's going. We are rapidly becoming a majority minority country. Old white guys like me are on the decline.
By the way, this isn't mentioned in one of your keys, but what does this say about changing demographic trends and social, I guess, economic priorities in the U.S. now that presumably, if you're right and Harris is going to win, Americans, at least more than half of Americans, are accepting a mixed race woman president. This is not, this is unprecedented. Yeah.
But it's certainly an incredibly positive development for the country that we're no longer locked in to white males as the only alternative for president, that the presidency is becoming more and more likely to reflect the country itself, which is no longer a white male dominated country.
Let me put it to you this way. How has the country changed in the last 40 years? Is someone like Kamala Harris, or was someone like Kamala Harris likely to win the White House 40 years ago when you first started doing this?
I think she was not likely to win the nomination. If she won the nomination, it would depend on when the keys fell out. In 2008, critics blasted me saying, got to change your keys. We've never had an African American running before. Country's not ready to elect an African American. Of course, I didn't change my keys. If I had, I would have been wrong. And the keys are incredibly robust. Talk about changes. Developmentally, the keys go back to 1860 when women didn't vote. African Americans were enslaved. A lot of our people from Eastern Europe, my ancestors, people from Asia and Latin America weren't here yet. We had no automobiles, no planes, no poles, no radio, no television. So the keys have survived enormous changes in our society, our economy, our demography, and our politics.
What would you attribute the major changes to our economy and our social landscape to over the last 40 years?
Obviously, huge technological changes in our society, huge demographic changes in our society, as I've already outlined. And through the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, we've become a society much more open to diversity and positions of power.
On your 13 keys, do you assign levels of confidence to your prediction? Suppose, let's say we have 5 keys for, 8 against versus 2 keys for, 11 against. Would you say I have more confidence in 11 keys versus 4?
I don't say that. Obviously, a shakier prediction would be one that turns on one key. But, as I said, unlike Nate Silver, who gives you these probabilities that can never be wrong, who's going to win or who's going to lose. So I can be falsified. You can find me wrong. And can I be wrong? Of course. I'm a human being. I'm not so arrogant to say I can't be wrong. Look,
Sure.
The patterns I've discerned have survived for 160 years. That doesn't mean something cataclysmic couldn't happen to change the pattern of history. The problem is you don't know it in advance until it's happened. That's why I never change the keys in response to the individual events of each election. Got to run.
Yeah, hypothetically, what would need to happen to change your mind in the next 2 months? I know that's a tall order, month and a half, really, but what would need to happen?
The greatest myth of American politics is the October surprise. I've always made my predictions before that. No October surprise supposedly has changed them. For example, in October, we had the Access Hollywood tape released in 2016. We've never had a president come close to bragging on tape about grabbing women by their private parts. And lots of people said, oh, you got to change your prediction of Trump. And I said, no, I don't change my predictions based on these ephemeral events.
Well, by the way, when that did come out, did you assign a scandal point against Trump?
No, he's not the incumbent. Remember, it's
Okay.
measured against the incumbent president.
I understand. And final question, Professor Lichtman.
Sure.
I'm not saying you will be wrong, but suppose you were wrong for the first time in 40 years. How would you reevaluate your keys? How would you go about that process?
I'd have to see how and why I was wrong. For example, I could be wrong because of shenanigans that implicate the vote. I could be wrong because a couple of hundred votes switch in one state. So I really can't say. But of course, as I said, of course I can be wrong. And if I'm wrong, I will evaluate. And maybe I'll pass on the keys since I'm getting old to my successors.
All right, excellent. Well, we appreciate your candor and your outlook and your analysis. Where can we find your work? You're the author of several books. Tell us where we can find your books.
Predicting the Next President, The Keys to the White House 2024 on Amazon or on Rowman and Littlefield, the publisher. I also have a live show every Tuesday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern, and you can find it at Allan Lichtman YouTube. And you can ask me any question you want on my live show.
All right. Well, Professor Lichtman, I appreciate you coming back to the show and consolidating your forecast for us. Thank you very much. Please follow Lichtman in the links down below. We'll speak soon. Take care.
Thank you, David. Bye-bye.
And thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.